Hello there, and welcome to Rod's Ramblings, a podcast reminiscing about cultural events and how they've affected this 60-something. I've spent most of my life listening to music, all types in fact, classic rock, folk, prog rock, indie, even a little bit of dance in my time. But no matter what the genre's been, my mantra has always been, if it's good, then I'll listen to it. The classification of good is where personal preference comes in. One type of music that I haven't really given credit to is classical. I realised that a few months ago and started to give it a go, so to speak. I enjoyed some of the music, but what I found most interesting was the stories behind the composers, the instruments they played and the places they played them. I think of it as my classical music discovery, and I'd like to share some of those stories with you over the next few episodes. So, let's get things started. If I said Bagatelle number 25 in A minor, would it mean anything to you? If I told you that this was the most downloaded mobile phone ringtone during the 1990s, would that help? Bear in mind that the Crazy Frog wasn't until the 2000s. Tell you what, let's listen to the first few notes. It is, of course, Furry Lees by Ludwig van Beethoven, one of the most popular pieces of music that's taught during music lessons, or at least it was in my day. I can still remember being rapped on the knuckles by my music teacher when I could only play the right-hand part. In fact, I can still only play the right-hand part. But getting back to our story, even though Beethoven never married, he had a number of relationships, and there are three candidates for whom Furry Lees could have been written for. They are Elisabeth Rockel, Elise Barenfeld and Therese Malfatti. Elisabeth Rockel was a German opera singer who knew Beethoven as a result of playing the title role in his opera Fidelio, and was often called Elise by the composer. Elise Barenfeld was a very strong candidate due to her Christian name. She was a German soprano who lived in Vienna with Beethoven's friend Johann Melzel. In 2012, Rita Stabling, a musicologist specialising in Beethoven, made a case for the music having been written as a favour for Melzel, giving her music lessons, but Stabling has since retracted that theory. Incidentally, Barenfeld was given singing lessons by the great Antonio Salieri, who we will no doubt talk about more when we discuss the life of Mozart. The favourite candidate is Therese Malfatti, and it is her version of the story that we'll concentrate on now. Therese was the eldest of two daughters. Her father had made his fortune in the silk trade, established his own sugar refinery, and owned a sumptuous house just off the fashionable Kartnerstrasse, along with a country estate in Wolkersdorf, about 40 miles northwest of Vienna. Therese was known to be volatile, impetuous. She was only 18 years of age in 1810, and was said by those that knew her to have more of the fiery Italian temperament in her than her slightly younger sister, or for that matter any other member of her family. The possibility that Beethoven's friends warned him of this, along with the fact that he was about to turn 40 years of age and that Therese was young enough to be his daughter, didn't seem to bother him. In fact, he no doubt saw himself as a bit of a prime catch. Beethoven had fallen in love, as simple as that. He'd improved his appearance, arranged for expensive linen shirts and neckties to be made, and was so certain that Therese would accept his marriage proposal that he paid a friend to collect his baptismal certificate from Bonn in order to meet the legal requirements and allow the wedding to go ahead. In order to clinch the deal, as it were, he wrote a piece of piano music for Therese, making it deliberately simple so that she could play it. Many thousands of failed music students and I are now screaming at the idea of it being simple. Sadly, despite such a romantic gesture, Beethoven was seriously misjudging the situation. Therese had not given him any sign that she felt the same way that he did. She was flattered by his attention, occasionally flirted with him, and certainly wanted to retain his friendship. However, things came to a head when Beethoven went to see her with the intention of popping the question. Whether it was to calm his nerves or not, we don't know. But leading up to the proposal, Beethoven became very drunk on strung punch and made a clumsy lunge at her. She was appalled and rejected him in no uncertain terms. The family immediately left Vienna, went to their estate in Wolkersdorf, and summoned the man who had introduced the couple to each other, Ignaz Gleichenstein, to join them. He was then given the unenviable task of writing to Beethoven, informing him of the family's displeasure and making it very clear that they did not wish Beethoven to ever see their daughter again. What a sad ending. Let's hear the music in full. This is Furry Lees by Ludwig van Beethoven. If you asked me to name musicians from the classical music era, I'd reel off a load of composers such as Beethoven, Mozart, Tchaikovsky, Bach, etc. But I couldn't tell you the names of any of the very talented musicians that played these composers' works. None, that is, except George Bridgetower. He was a well-respected violinist employed by the Prince of Wales when he succeeded to the throne as George IV. Armed with a letter of introduction from his employer, Bridgetower travelled from London to Vienna, where he met Karl Alois, the second Prince Lichnowsky, patron of music at the Austrian court, where he was introduced to Beethoven. As you would expect from such a meeting, Beethoven invited Bridgetower to play and accompanied him on the piano. Bridgetower must have been delighted to have the honour of playing for such an esteemed composer, and apparently Beethoven was equally impressed with the violinist's ability. Later that summer, a series of concerts were due to be held in the Pavilion in Augerton Park, and it was suggested that Beethoven should compose a new violin sonata which he and Mr. Bridgetower could premiere at the festival's opening concert. There was less than a month to go, and Bridgetower's emotions quickly went from pride to concern that he wouldn't have time to learn the music. As the date for the concert approached, he persistently pressed Beethoven to finish the piece as soon as possible so that he could practice it. In order to give him something to work on, Beethoven took the final movement from a sonata he had composed the preceding year and made that the final movement of the new sonata. He then started work on the opening movement, beginning it with fiendishly difficult double stopping across all four strings, and possibly because he was confident that the violinist was capable of playing it, made it even longer and more complex. It became clear that the second movement would not be ready in time, and the concert was put back by 2 days to the 24th of May. The night before the concerts were due to begin at 8 a.m, Beethoven was still writing the second movement. It's probable that Bridgetower, fearing his reputation was about to be torn to shreds, stood over the composer, rehearsing as each note was written down. During the first movement of the performance, something quite extraordinary happened. In bar 18 of the Presto, which was the fast section, Beethoven had written a huge arpeggio run for the piano, up 2 octaves, down 2 octaves, up 2 octaves again, with a final leap from a top note to a bass note. During this virtuosic display, the violinist could do nothing but stand and watch, but Beethoven had marked the Presto to be repeated, and in the second playthrough, when it came to the run, Bridgetower watched Beethoven's fingers fly up and down the keyboard, at which point he fixed the violin under his chin and imitated it note for note. Beethoven looked up at Bridgetower in utter astonishment. The audience must have held its breath as he leapt up from the piano stool, ran across to his violinist, hugged him and shouted, "Again, my dear fellow!" ran back to the piano, played his run, and then held the sustain key as Bridgetower again copied it on the violin. The audience was entirely won over, which was no bad thing, since Bridgetower was compelled to play the second movement from Beethoven's hastily scribbled manuscript, which he achieved with great success. The third movement, the only one that Bridgetower had had time to rehearse fully, was flawless. The performance was a triumph, so much so that Beethoven dedicated the sonata there and then to the Englishman. Sadly for Bridgetower, that's not the end of the story. It might have been at the celebratory supper following the concert, or shortly afterwards, that Bridgetower made the mistake of his life. During the meal, he made a derogatory remark about a lady that Beethoven was very fond of. The composer was appalled by his comments and immediately withdrew his dedication. The violinist tried to reason with him, no doubt arguing that it was just a joke and he hadn't meant anything bad by it. He might also have urged Beethoven's friends to intercede on his behalf, but it was no good. Beethoven's mind was made up. No one who could say such a thing was to have a composition by the great master dedicated to him. As you would expect, Bridgetower left Vienna under a dark cloud, and the two men never met again. The next we hear about Bridgetower is that in later life he lived in Peckham, South London. There are two sad endings to this story. Firstly, Bridgetower died in poverty and is buried in Kensal Green Cemetery west of London, his name forgotten to history. And secondly, after withdrawing the dedication, Beethoven sent the manuscript to a French violinist living in Paris by the name of Rudolf Kreutzer with a dedication to him. The sonata that bears his name, the Kreutzer Sonata, is now acknowledged as the greatest violin sonata by Beethoven or anyone. And do you know what Monsieur Kreutzer said when he received the manuscript and examined it? He said that it was impossible to play, it was the music of the devil, and he never once performed the violin sonata that bears his name. The piece of music in question was the Violin Sonata No. 9. I think that we can all agree that today music is more accessible than it's ever been. Via the streaming service of your choice, you can listen to the latest single, album, live recording, or in some cases, your favourite artist's entire music collection. This has been good for the listener, but due to the amount of money that the artists are paid per download, not so good for them. Whether this has resulted in artists having to go on the road in order to make money or not, I can only guess. But in recent times, there have been more and more tours making the headlines. For example, you can't go far these days without hearing Taylor Swift being mentioned. The Eras Tour is her sixth tour starting on the 17th of March 2023 and is due to finish on December the 8th this year. It will consist of 152 shows over 5 continents and will take in more than $1 billion. In the 18th century, streaming services didn't exist, and you'd probably be thrown into a dungeon somewhere if you ever came out with the phrase. As a result, musicians had to promote themselves by performances and word of mouth. I believe that the most travelled classical music composer was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. In all, as man and boy, Mozart took 17 journeys throughout Europe, a total of 3,720 days, amounting to 10 years, 2 months and 2 days, which, if you take away his years as baby and toddler, in turn equates to nearly 1/3 of his life. History tells us that these travels didn't take in as much money as the Eras Tour. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Mozart's father, Leopold, had recognised very early on that Wolfgang and his sister, Nannerl, were very talented and took them on tour, making the most of their child prodigy status. Nannerl was very talented, but not as much as her brother, and as they got older and the child prodigy label could no longer be used, Leopold took Wolfgang on his own. Sadly, not every attempt to perform before the gentry of the time was successful, as the following story demonstrates. Leopold's plan was to head to Stuttgart, seat of Duke Karl Eugen, known to be a great patron of the arts and generous with his financial rewards for artists. In Leopold's pocket was a glowing letter of recommendation from a senior canon in Salzburg, but en route, while at a coaching station changing horses, Leopold found out that the Duke had left for his country palace north of Stuttgart and was intending to travel on from there to his hunting lodge. Undeterred, but no doubt cursing under his breath, Leopold ordered his coachman to change course in the hope of catching the Duke at his palace. He and the family arrived before the Duke had moved on, and Leopold lost no time in making contact with the Duke's Italian Kapellmeister. He brandished his letter of recommendation, but the Italian shrugged. Duke Eugen's every minute was taken up with moving, with an entourage of almost 2,000, to his hunting lodge. Even an audience was out of the question, let alone a musical recital. Leopold appealed to the Duke's master of hounds in a somewhat desperate attempt to persuade him to delay everything. This not only failed, but it backfired. The official, knowing that the Duke was worried that he didn't have enough horses for his huge entourage, commandeered Leopold's, leaving the man with nothing. It's time for a piece of music, so this is Eine kleine Nachtmusik by the man himself, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. That was Eine kleine Nachtmusik by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. If I ask you what Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and Johann Sebastian Bach have in common, you may answer that they are well-known and respected composers of classical music. But if I ask you the question, what do Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and P.D.Q. Bach have in common, you may well ask, who's P.D.Q. Bach? Well, P.D.Q. Bach is the pseudonym of Peter Schickel, an American composer specialising in musical parodies. Now that you know that, I'll repeat the question. What do Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and P.D.Q. Bach have in common? The answer is the piece of music that we just listened to. Well, sort of. Mozart died during the night of 4th of December 1791. Over 190 years later, Peter Schickel, acting as his pseudonym, premiered A Little Nightmare Music at Carnegie Hall in New York. It's a small opera supposedly based on a dream that the composer had on the night that Mozart died. A recording of the original cast of the opera was made, which included a composition entitled Royal Fire Water Music, which is a parody of Handel's Water Music and music for the Royal Fireworks. Other parodies that P.D.Q. Bach has produced are the 1712 Overture, based on Tchaikovsky's 1812, Bach Portrait, based on Aaron Copland's Lincoln Portrait, and The Preachers of Prometheus, based on Beethoven's Creatures of Prometheus. There have been many subsequent performances parodying other classics. If you go into YouTube and search for A Little Nightmare Music, you'll find performances by comedy duo Alexei Igudesman and Hyung Ki-jo. They're very, very funny, and I really do recommend you give them a little bit of time. What they do with pieces of wood is well worth watching. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode of my classical discovery, and I look forward to sharing more stories with you in the future. In the meantime, I'm off to practice the left hand of Fur Elise. So, until the next episode of Rod's Ramblings, cheers and take care.